Hi, this is Juliet Rooney Varga. I'll get my webcam going in a moment. Hello. And today I'm here with Jennifer Haskell. We're here to welcome you to a webinar about the World Climate Project. And Jennifer, do you want to?
Oh, hi, everybody. I'm here with Juliet, as she said, and we're going to introduce you today to the World Climate Project and World Climate Exercise, and hope that you will be very excited about what we have to offer here and learn a lot from it, how you can take it out to do more with it. But Juliet's going to start us off with some information, and she was in Paris, and so she might be able to share some interesting things with you and some ideas we have for how we're going to incorporate the Paris Agreement into world climate. We haven't had a chance to do it yet, and we're going to be working on it over the next few weeks to see how we can do it, but she can give you some ideas. So Juliet, why don't you start us off with the information you have about Paris, and then I'll move on to the more general information about world climate.
Yeah, and I just want to orient people too that anytime that you have a question or you'd like to check in with us about something, please feel free to type your questions in the question box, and we'll do our best to keep an eye on that and to also spend some time at the end of the webinar answering questions. We will, the webinar will end at 9:30, but Jennifer and I are happy to hang around and spend a little bit of time talking with you if you have further questions after that. So as Jennifer just mentioned, several of us, including myself and others from the Climate Interactive team, returned recently from Paris, and I'm quite sure that many of you on the line today too also were there. So I think we're all sort of digesting what happened in Paris and what it means moving forward. And I think that as we consider this exercise, which is a simulation of the UN climate negotiations moving forward, coming back from Paris, I find that I'm reflecting on how relevant this simulation remains, and in fact, how it's even more relevant in many ways than it was before. So I want to talk a little bit about how I see that and why. So I think when we really look at what Paris delivered, I see really three key things that stick out in sort of what's changed since that agreement. And I think one thing that was really clear is that Paris has delivered a goal, and it's delivered a shared vision. And that's really a shared vision of a low carbon society, of a decarbonized society. So we know kind of where we're headed. Another important thing that Paris delivered, I think, is that it really was the first time that there was a very clear understanding that every single country is already experiencing the impacts of climate change and recognizes that their own self-interest is very clearly aligned with the common goal of addressing a global problem. So what really has played out over many years as what we call a tragedy of the commons kind of a system, we're starting to see shift, and the dynamics of the negotiations shifted. I think that it'll be interesting to see how the dynamics of the simulated negotiations may also shift. And then the other piece that I think, especially coming from the United States and from other English-speaking countries like the UK and Australia, to some extent Canada, you know, one thing that was really clear is that despite the fact that some of our countries still seem to be caught up in a debate about whether climate change is real, whether it's caused by humans, and whether it's on balance, you know, not only negative for human society, but potentially catastrophic for human society, that debate on the global stage is over. And there is amongst world leaders, there was no debate about the reality and the urgency of addressing climate change. So I think that it's only a matter of time before those of us who might be a little bit behind catch up. And I think that the momentum from Paris is going to make that happen faster. So the question is really no longer, you know, does the world want to combat climate change, but rather how will the world combat climate change? And I think that's, I think especially for those of us coming from places like the US, where oftentimes we're sort of looking at what's going on and scratching our heads. That debate is, I think, going to be put to rest fairly quickly. So looking at the news this morning, I think it was kind of interesting how a lot of the climate change news this morning actually drove home just how important an exercise like World Climate is going to be in the coming years. And here's one, Paris Climate Change Accord is just the beginning. There were some that were saying, is this a failed accord? And what are the next steps? And you can see here below, it says agreement signals hope for the planet, but the struggle is far from over. And I think that really speaks to, this idea of a vision, but not of a roadmap that's clear of how we're going to achieve that vision. So what do I mean by that? Well, here's an analysis looking at some different pathways moving forward. So here we have on the horizontal axis the year from 2000 to 2100. So clearly, we're almost in 2016 now. So 2015 right around here. And then greenhouse gas emissions in gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year, or in other words, in billions of tons of CO2 equivalents per year on the vertical axis. So what do we see? Well, what we see is that the pledges that were put on the table coming into Paris, the intended nationally determined contributions, or INDCs, represent significant progress over what we've referred to as business as usual, or in other words, no action. As I tell my students, I think the phrase business as usual it doesn't really make a lot of sense anyway, because things are going to change a lot. But compared to no action, that blue line, we see the INDCs delivering about a degree, or going from 4.5 degrees C above pre-industrial times to about 3.5 degrees C above pre-industrial times, with the pledges that were on the table in Paris, that were agreed to in Paris. We know that a 3.5 degrees C outcome is nowhere near the kind of world that we want to be leaving to our children. We don't even, know, it's entirely unclear that we would be able to adapt to that world. So that's not something that is the goal that was agreed upon in Paris. In fact, the goal that was agreed upon was much closer to this ratchet success. So the language was well below 2 degrees C above pre-industrial, and as close to 1.5 degrees C as possible. And that is shown in this green or gray line here. And so you can see that the gap between what's the actual pledges that were put on the table and the needed ambition to reach the stated goal is quite vast. In fact, it's bigger than the gap between no action and current INDCs. I'm gonna skip this slide right now. So, and I think just for those of us in different parts of the world, looking at this problem from our own perspectives, we could take a look at what does this mean for other developing. Well, it's this curve. These are nations in most of Africa, South America, some of the Middle East. This curve versus this curve. In the U.S., we're talking about here, this line here, versus a line where we really start seeing deep declines happening quickly. So I don't want to get too much into the weeds here, but just want to point out that really no matter what part of the world you're coming from, the difference between the current INDCs, the current pledges, and a successful scenario that meets the stated goals of Paris is quite large. And I love this picture. This was my colleague, Frank Niepold, who leads the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's education program, as well as the U.S. Global Change Research Program's education work. And he we took a look, we showed him these graphs, the same graphs that I just showed you, and his response was, that is why we are here. That is why, education, communication, and decision support are so critical moving forward, because these gaps need to drive our work moving forward. All right, I'm going to hand it over to Jennifer. Let me just see. Jennifer, are you there? One moment. Okay.
Okay, now I'm unmuted. Sorry. I had to go back and find that button. You see my screen?
Okay. So I just changed the presenter. I just want to make sure there's two other, do you have control over that?
Yeah. I do. You see my screen now?
One moment.
Okay.
Nope. Right now I'm seeing the, right now we're seeing the World Climate Project webinar screenshot.
How's that?
Give it a moment to refresh. Still seeing that right now. Do you want me to? Okay, I can also continue with. Oh.
It's just coming. It's changing really slow. Yeah. Well, let me just go on, and you can tell me when I change if it ever eventually. Oh, you took it away.
Oh no, I didn't take it away, but I'm happy to. I could also just advance the slides for you. How's that?
Well, let's see what happens. Okay, so enough with the slide screens, everybody. So you've heard some really interesting information from Juliet about what was happening in Paris and some of the results of Paris. And I think it's really important because the World Climate Project, which we're talking about today, and the World Climate Exercise is something that we're trying to build a global facilitator community. And we're trying to make sure that we are inviting you, your friends, your family, anybody you know, your colleagues, to consider hosting an event, facilitating this event. It can be a transformative exercise that helps people address climate change, and we're hoping to spread it even further around the world. I think it's interesting to note that in Paris, there were something like 190 nations there. 186 countries submitted their pledges to the UN. And amazingly, the final document that came out of Paris was stronger than the draft that was presented coming into the conference. And it included, the final agreement includes transparency, accountability, and some really ambitious goals. And for those reasons, really, the Paris Agreement is kind of unprecedented in history in terms of internationally negotiated agreements. The idea that the final draft was stronger than the draft coming in doesn't usually happen. It usually things get watered down. So now is the time that we want to keep up the momentum, and we want to get World Climate out there to more and more people. It's important to note that World Climate is based on our computer model called C-ROADS, which is short for Climate Rapid Overview and Decision Support tool, and it's been used in a lot of academic settings around the world, but it really started out as a tool for informed decision making, and it's been used by government officials and government leaders for that. We have reached more than 10,000 people this year alone with World Climate, which we think is pretty impressive. There were more than 246 events. I think this slide is sort of out of date the second we make it, because every day we learn about more events, and we are pretty certain that there are events happening out there that we don't know about. We only started asking people to register their events a few months ago, so it's actually more than this. And in 45 countries, that's incredible. Countries really literally from Argentina to Zimbabwe, and 43 more countries in between there. Hundreds of people, including those of you on this webinar, have been asking to run this exercise. And there's a demand. There's a demand for engagement. It's clear. And we think that you all can really help us with this. You can do this in your workplace, in your faith-based organization, in your school, as a part of your classes or part of an extracurricular activity. This is the growth in interest that we've had. I think this is interesting. You can see we've had, just since June, you see the date is June 12, 2015, since we started keeping track of this, but the growth of interest, meaning people who've actually indicated on our website that they were interested in following World Climate, has really grown tremendously, and with about half of that interest being in the U.S. and half from overseas. And I think it's interesting to note that as it's played overseas, we have the game, we have materials in English, in Spanish, in French, in German, in Portuguese, Japanese, and Chinese. And of course, we need them in more languages. And if any of you would like to volunteer to translate our materials, we would love that. And you can just let us know. We'll give you some email addresses at the end, and you can let us know if you're interested in translating. And I want to give a good shout out to Munia and to Luisa Berto-Ambrosio, who are both, I think, on the webinar this morning, who have both provided translations, some French and some Portuguese. So we really appreciate that assistance. It lets us get this simulation out to even more people around the world. I think that we've been so happy to see this phenomenon have it spread. People like you are going to sort of become the basis of a global swarm, we like to think, of people who are advancing the dialogue on climate change. And we think at this time there needs to be more opportunities for serious engagement through personal experiences that are non-dogmatic and that help people think for themselves, testing their own assumptions, building hope and enthusiasm for the future. So we work very closely with Dr. John Sterman, who's a professor at the MIT Sloan School of Management. He was one of the developers of the model and the game, or the simulation. And he actually had the opportunity to do a quick version of World Climate with the Dalai Lama earlier this year, which is really exciting. He uses World Climate in his executive MBA classes at MIT. We also know that Senator John Kerry, who's now, of course, Secretary of State, and after Paris, we know a negotiator extraordinaire, he has used World Climate at C-ROADS anyway, not the game, but the models the game is based on. But we also know that climate change is not an issue just for leaders, so it's for all citizens, and we think it needs to be discussed in living rooms, as I said, classrooms, boardrooms, clubhouses, faith-based organizations, I don't know, bus stops, wherever you happen to be. And we want people to become informed and to be able to think for themselves. And we've noticed a lot of very smart people and reasonably informed people don't think about climate change enough. So we're hoping that by exposing people to this very experiential activity, that they'll become motivated to seek ways to take action to address climate change. One of the most important parts of our game, or the simulation, it's a game, depending on how you want to look at it as an exercise, is the debrief. After the negotiation rounds, we ask people how did participating in the exercise make them feel. And you can see this guy, he really felt like it was doable. So we achieved the goal of making people have some hope. We want people to understand how difficult the problem is, but we also want them to not be too depressed at the end and find that it is technically feasible and doable to address climate change. But we need everyone working together to do this across traditional boundaries and putting aside differences and just talking to each other. You can see also we have done it, the simulation is played quite a bit in China, as you can see here. And I like to tell people this little story that I have, and Juliet was in this training. She was conducting the training. I was in some training for World Climate at MIT back in July, and there was someone else in the training who was taking the executive MBA courses at MIT, and he had not really thought much about climate change. He had to participate in World Climate in his class. He wasn't so keen on doing it, but he went to class and did it, and it transformed him. He actually called his wife on his way home from class to tell her about it, and that's what led him to participate in the facilitator training. And I know that just a couple of weeks ago, he and his wife led their first World Climate exercise in a local parish church up in, I think in Massachusetts. And he wrote a blog post for our website about that experience, which you can go onto our website and look for. But I thought that was a really instructive story for me, because it showed me how powerful World Climate can be. That someone who was smart, but and he thought climate change was an issue, but really wasn't doing anything about it, how it really changed him and motivated him to take action. Juliet had showed a minute ago there the bathtub with our co-director, Drew Jones. We like to bring some science into world climate, and we try to incorporate the concept, the system dynamic concept of stocks and flows, and how that relates to the concentration and accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and what it takes to not just stop adding to it, but to get a decrease in the concentration of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. So we have that in the facilitation guide in case you don't really know how to talk about that. And you can also find on our website a bathtub simulation sort of little app. But that's included. So we bring science into the discussion during the exercise, and we also bring in the political realities, and it's a good exercise for bringing those two together. But it's very important as we move ahead to remain positive and have grounded hope. And you can see this next person on the next slide is, we were there, who's really like saying, yay, you know, this is great, we're going to go out, we're going to do this. So we see this is Professor Sturman again with some of his class playing, but we are actually doing research on the educational impact of world climate, and Juliet is the leader of that research. So I'll let her talk about that.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer. So yeah, as Jennifer mentioned, we currently have a project funded by the United States National Science Foundation to take a look to first further develop the materials that we have, and then and make sure that they remain on the cutting edge, and then also to take a look at what the learning impacts are. And that science piece is definitely critical. There are some key systems thinking and science concepts that a lot of people get wrong when you start talking about something as complicated as climate change, that we think are can really be delivered. Those insights can really be delivered effectively by world climate. So one thing that we've done is a pilot longitudinal study, going back and asking students if they remember their world climate experience that was anywhere from a year to 4 years prior to the time that we asked. And we found that over 80%, actually about 89% of them, do remember that experience. So we're talking about a 2-hour experience, usually offered as a lab period in one of my classes. And I can certainly tell you that if you asked me if I remembered a specific lab exercise 4 years after I did that lab exercise, chances are I probably would not have remembered it. But with world climate, people did remember that experience. They also actually held on to the insights that the exercise delivered. So the learning outcomes, when we looked at, I don't know if we have a little bit of noise in the background, maybe it'd be good to mute. When we asked them, basically gave them a post survey, asking them if they could answer questions correctly about climate change, they retained the information that they had learned for that long period of time. As Jennifer mentioned too, we really are interested in how world climate affects people's motivation to get involved more, whether it's learning more or getting involved in addressing this challenge. That's something that we would certainly be excited, and so far we've found has been true. So once again, over 80% of the people that we've asked so far report that they are as motivated or more motivated to address climate change after experiencing world climate. So here's just a slide showing some initial results from undergraduates, about 70 undergraduate students that we asked them to write open-ended responses to questions about their experience. And the majority of them reported gaining an appreciation of the complexity of this problem, an improved understanding of how serious climate change is, sort of the scale and urgency of the problem. They also gained an appreciation of the social dynamics of decision making, and that's something that Jennifer mentioned, that the exercise is very effective at delivering both scientific understanding, but also importantly a social understanding. And as I mentioned, they had an increased motivation to take action. All right, so rather than tell you too much more, we want to kind of take you through this and actually get to playing a quick version of the game. So when you facilitate World Climate, if you're a male, you would take on the role of the Secretary General of the United Nations, currently Ban Ki-moon. Or,
of course, the new Secretary General will be a woman someday.
That's right.
Sorry.
This is all. Thank you for that reminder. And then when I'm facilitating the exercise for the last few years, I've been taking on the role of the Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC, Christiana Figueres. And what we do is we actually set up the room to reflect the geopolitical inequities that actually play out in the negotiations. So we've got the wealthy part of the world with the United States and the EU, Japan, Canada, New Zealand, some of those other wealthy countries having a pretty nice set of furniture if possible, but certainly a bunch of donuts or some food. And they're, things are looking pretty good for them. We try to give them a little more space, maybe in the front of the room. Then we've got the rapidly developing world. So India, China come to the fore, and in this case, in the 3-block version, countries like Brazil would be there as well. And they typically get a little bit of, some food, certainly. Things are maybe a little bit more crowded, but they are starting to move to a more powerful political position. And then in the back of the room, on the floor with no food and no chairs, we have the low-lying ocean states, the AOSIS countries, and we have the countries that are less developed, so most African nations, much of South America, much of the Middle East, and they kind of have to deal with those circumstances. So we find that, and I've actually had my vice chancellor sitting on the floor in one of those less developed countries playing that role, and she did a great job. So I think what we find is that people people sort of get into these roles. It's really important for you to do that too. And then they can see the world from a place that's different from where they're actually sitting. And in fact, I would just mention that we typically put people into blocks or geopolitical teams that are different from where they actually come from. Everybody gets a briefing statement that lays out their country's interests. And it also provides them with some data on historical emissions and expected projections for emissions. They have an opportunity to formulate a position and then to advocate for that position. They make pledges to the UN, like the INDCs. They can lobby other groups and try to compel other blocs to to take action that's in their interest. They negotiate with each other. And then the key part here is that we check the results against the science using the simulation. And this slide shows the C-Learn simulation, which is an online version of the 3-block simulation, but we also have C-Roads, which can be run locally on your own computer with either 3 blocks or 6 blocks. This is a demonstration of the sea level rise. We actually use a tarp or a sheet and just enable people to experience this idea of rising seas and influencing, people are clearly having fun, but of course it's a very serious and real impact. Okay, so we've been pleased with the media coverage that we've gotten. In fact, in Paris, we ran World Climate there, and ABC News and the Associated Press covered it, which was really exciting. This article here from Science it's only a game, but even earth scientists struggle to defeat global warming. That was actually from the time that I ran World Climate at the American Geophysical Union meeting, which is the largest climate and earth science meeting in the world. And that was really fascinating because in that case, climate scientists were really struggling with the social dynamics of a system that they had not understood. And I think without any further ado, would love to go ahead and play a short version of the game, and then we'll answer your questions. Okay, so I am now going to take on the role of Christiana Figueres. I am Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the United Nations. Distinguished delegates, welcome from around the world. And I will now take you to the simulation, and we will ask you for your inputs to it. So here we've got one moment. Let me just move. Okay. And Jennifer, just to check with you, can you see?
Yes,
roads?
we see sea roads.
Sea roads, great, thanks. And maybe you could help me with what's well, let me orient people, and then we'll try to get some pledges. All right, so what you see here then is the 3-block version. We've got 2 graphs. On the left-hand side, you've got a graph looking at the emissions of carbon dioxide on an annual basis to the atmosphere. So we've got billions of tons of CO2 per year on the vertical axis and year on the horizontal axis. And what you can see is that the brown line represents the less developed countries. The red line represents the developed countries, and the green line represents rapidly developing countries like China, India, Brazil. And then on the right side over here, we see the same horizontal axis, and then on the vertical axis, we've got temperature rise above pre-industrial times. So here we've got the 2°C goal, although coming out of Paris, we might want to move that number down a little bit, right? So Paris, the goal coming out of Paris was well below 2°C, if not 1.5. However, what you see here are in the emission side on the left-hand side and the temperature and the goal are business as usual. And we're interpreting that to be RCP 8.5, or in other words, the IPCC accepted emissions trajectory that does not involve strong action on climate change. So we are delegates, we are currently headed to about a 4.5°C outcome by 2100, and we need to do better. So what we are asking you to do is to make a decision, and I don't know if anybody would like to represent the wealthy countries of the world. Would like you, a wealthy country person, to make a decision about when the growth in emissions will stop, when these emissions will stop going up and they will flatline. Does anybody want to step up and type something in the chat box?
I think we have to have them type in the question box. I don't think they see the chat box. Yeah, question box. Somebody needs to type in a emissions stop growth. There.
Okay, we've got, great. So I'm going to go with 2030 by Becky English. And while I'm doing that, if somebody else, I need a delegate from the rapidly developing countries, from developing A, to step up and make a decision about a stop growth year for those developing countries. Okay, so as I did that, what you see, if you saw the lines move, what we've got now is that those developed countries flatlining in 2030, so emissions stabilize, and we've got that nice flat line. Moving forward, then I want to also make some decisions for the developing countries. So we've got now 2035 from Victoria. Thanks, Victoria. And those African nations and nations from South America, could you please make a decision for the less developed countries what you want to do for stabilizing emissions? Somebody want to give me a number? All right.
I'm not seeing one. Just pick one.
All right. I'm going to go with, we're going to be a little bit less ambitious than we have less money to go with than the rapidly developing countries. So we're going to go with 2040. Okay. That's exactly what, thank you, Becky. And all right, so we can see then that emissions have stabilized by 2040 from all of these blocks. And we actually end up with an outcome that is fairly similar to what the INDC delivered, which is pretty much giving us an outcome of about 3.5 degrees, or sorry, looks like we're just over 4 degrees C by the end of the century. So we are nowhere near that goal. And of course, the reason is that when we look at what's happening with emissions, right, this graph shows us emissions, which we can think of as if the atmosphere is a bathtub, it's a finite volume, and emissions represent flow into that finite space. Then we've got emissions being greater than removal, or the flow into the bathtub being greater than the draining from it. And so despite the fact that emissions have stabilized, they're still greater than the removals, and we still end up accumulating CO2 in the atmosphere and overshooting our goal. So let's go back and do more. Can we have emissions reducing? So who would like to, and for Rebecca, just a note that you don't see the chat box. If you could just use the question box, that would be great. Okay, you don't see the data entries. Well, we'll be reading them off. So if we could have emissions begin to be reduced, and I'm going to go ahead and just enter some decisions because time is getting short. Or Jennifer, if you want to give me some decisions, that'd be great too.
Okay, begin reducing. We got a 2020, but yeah, I think you have to make it after we have peaked. Again, it has to be after we peaked.
Yep. So we're going to go.
Keep putting 2035. Just say we're going to peak and start immediately reducing.
Okay, got it. So we'll do that, and we're going to start reducing at. Now we typically tell people that we don't know how fast we could reduce, but a 3.5% annual rate of reduction, that's year after year, continued reduction at a given rate. 3.5% annual rate of reduction is very ambitious, and most economists, at least in the past, have told us that that would be, going beyond that would represent significant cost and potentially damage to the economy. So let's just say we start off with something. Anybody want to give me a number for annual rate of reduction?
Let's say that for developed to move it along is going to be 2.5.
Okay. So now we see that red line coming down, and we see temperature change being impacted by that. How about for developing A?
Someone want to give us a percentage annual reduction there? There's 3.0 from Victoria.
Great. Okay. So 3.0?
Yes.
Very ambitious. All right. So now that line is coming down, and we are getting much closer to the goal. So we're making a lot of progress. What about from the developing B countries?
You have a 2045
and rate of decline.
You could use Alejandro's 3%. There's oof.
Should we go with a 3?
Yeah.
Okay, so we are seeing dramatic declines happening globally, but pushed off a little bit, and we are getting close to our goal, but we are still overshooting it. So around 2.5 degrees C outcome, much, much better than what the INDCs deliver, but not reaching that goal from Paris yet. So what would we need to do to drive, to basically to reach the goal? And Becky is saying, give us 4% rate of reduction. So you're hitting on steep rates of reduction would certainly help us meet that goal. What else would help us meet that goal?
Lowering the rate of increase prior to stopping the growth.
Yeah, so if we can,
so Victoria is asking if the model can account for lowering the rate of increase prior to stopping the growth.
So the answer is the model can. We currently have it in a simplified setup for the World Climate Exercise. And let me get back to that question later. But the model can, but in this setup, we can't do that. We purposefully are trying to keep the decisions relatively straightforward for the purpose of the exercise. So let me just let's just try pushing it out a little bit. So what we need to do is we need to pull those times in. We need closer action, action that happens faster in order to achieve these goals, right? Because the longer that we wait, what happens when we wait? We're still filling up that bathtub with emissions. If we turn the spigot off sooner, we have a better chance of meeting the goal. So if we push everyone's actions here, closer to nearer term, we get closer to the goal. Is there anything else that anybody would like to add to do before we wrap up and go to questions?
So I think I'll spend 2.5.
Yeah. So I think we'll you get the idea. I do want to make sure that we leave time for questions, but you can see how as I ratchet up the ambition, oops, sorry, that meant that to be a 3, and also bring action closer to the current time, we're more likely to reach the goal.
And I think it's interesting here, Juliet, to bring in the Paris Agreement again, and that the Paris Agreement is asking for stock taking in 2018, where countries are supposed to be providing their how they're doing and meeting their INDCs, and then possibility for 2020 to revise their commitments in order to have ambition beyond 2030. And that's kind of what you're showing, is if you change it, how it can have an impact.
Yes. And I also just want to point out, too, that there are a lot of aspects of the model that I haven't had a chance to show you yet. I just want to give you a quick tour. We can take a look at sea level rise impacts. So here you see sea level as under business as usual, that RCP 8.5, exceeding 1 meter. And actually, this is a conservative estimate. I would say it's highly likely to exceed far more than 1 meter by 2100. And then this is basically the Rahmstorff model to look at sea level rise. And then not quite making it to 1 meter with the scenario that we have created. We also have ocean pH, so you can see a really substantial difference in terms of ocean acidification as a result of carbon dioxide that dissolves into the oceans, forming carbonic acid. So looking at business as usual, we're down below a pH of 7.8, and with the action that you all have taken, we are closer to, much closer to a pH of 8, a much better outcome in terms of ocean acidification. You can also take a look at land use, so we can make decisions about deforestation and afforestation. And if you're a science geek like me, then you could also take a look at a lot of the scientific assumptions about the climate system. I'm not going to dig into this right now, but you can adjust. If you don't believe some of these estimates, for example, climate sensitivity of 3, you can see what happens if it's lower or higher. So I'll just leave it at that. And let's go back to our slide deck and leave some time for questions.
That's great, Juliet. If I can just jump in too a little bit here and mention that for everybody, we just try to give you a taste of what working with the model and doing the game is like. But on our website, we also have the software for the C-Roads is downloadable, or C-Learn, you can connect to C-Learn through the website, and we have a lot of facilitation materials on the website. There's a how-to, Juliet did a how-to video. You can watch videos of the game, the simulation being played. You can find the briefing materials that you would hand out to the participants. You can even get the table tints, that you can print to indicate which table is for which block. So all of those are on the website. It's all open source. There's, of course, never a charge for any of that. We just want to get this out there and educate and inform as many people as we can. So you can go onto the website and take everything off there and play with it as much as you want. I noticed that we had a question from Rebecca. It says, Juliet, maybe if you want to mention it, about how does the game address the policies that would be required to achieve the various percentage change rates, and without that, how are people understanding what the costs are going to be?
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Rebecca. That's a really important question. So basically I'll answer that with two things. One is that we have another simulation called En-ROADS, which focuses on policies that you can take or that could be taken to address climate change: energy efficiency, carbon pricing, assumptions about population and consumption, subsidies and prices for different sources of energy. And you can actually take a look at the cost of energy that those different policies, the influence on the cost of energy that those different policies might have. I'll tell you honestly, though, in C-Roads and World Climate, I guess two pieces there. One is that we've found that people tend to constrain each other. So the negotiations we don't see a whole lot of unconstrained pledges. In fact, people tend to be fairly conservative in terms of what they're willing to put forward, partly because the briefing statements provide some information about that. But then also, there's a lot of uncertainty around climate change economics. So once you start to factor in the cost of inaction and the potential cost of impacts of climate change, as well as the co-benefits of taking action, there is, in fact, so much uncertainty around cost that you could say that oftentimes even the sign of the cost, whether it's a net cost or a net benefit, is not clear. So we've tended to avoid providing a graph or real-time feedback, in terms of what the economic cost would be because of that uncertainty, and let people just grapple with that decision and their own assumptions about it through the negotiation.
Thanks, Juliet. There's a question about the minimum number of participants and facilitators, and I wanted to, this is a really good question because I wanted to mention how flexible this exercise is. There are sort of optimal numbers, but there aren't really minimum and maximums. We want there to be teams because the social dynamic of interaction and trying to negotiate is an important part of the game, but you could sit with someone and show them and run through this and how it works almost alone, maybe similarly to how Professor Sturman did it with the Dalai Lama. But I've done it with, say, 10 or 11 people, and it still works quite well, and you can use the 3 region, and then that's a good number for that. We have a video on our website of it being done with something like 150, 200 people. It's a little bit different way to do it than what we've been describing here, but probably the optimal number is around 30 people. But really don't let that hinder your enthusiasm to do it. You really just need one facilitator. Sometimes it's nice to have someone to help you. That can be someone who's never done it before, so that's not difficult. But I also want to mention the flexibility of the game in terms of time. I think that ideally, it's good to have 2.5 hours, even 3 hours, depending on how many rounds of negotiation you want to undertake. We think it's best to do at least 2. 3 can be really good as well, and it depends on how much discussion you're going to allow during the game. But we have had it done in an hour. It's really pushing it. We even have a version on the website that's like World Climate in 20 minutes. You're not going to get the same value out of it, but it's maybe better than having no discussion about it at all. So I just want to make it clear that not to let some of these, there's nothing rigid about it. The game's very flexible.
Yeah, and Ralph has a question about what means of measuring on a real-time basis are taken into account to get data on CO2 emissions and temperature change. So I'm not 100% sure I understand the question, but I think I do. So tell me, Ralph, if I'm getting this right. Basically, we use data from the Carbon Dioxide Information Analysis Center on CO2 data. So it's like a vetted, internationally used data base on CO2. And we also use, the models are calibrated to, or C-ROADS is calibrated and tested against the models used in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Assessment Report, so the fifth assessment report, and the CMIP models, so much more complex models. And we didn't have time to show you those data, but C-ROADS output matches both projections, and so C-ROADS projections match the CMIP or the IPCC models very well, and we also use hindcasting to look at how C-ROADS compares to historical data, and we also see a very nice match there. So feel free to ask another question, Ralph, if that didn't answer your question.
So thanks, Juliet. I think I don't know if either of us mentioned yet either that the C-ROADS has been peer reviewed.
Yes,
thoroughly peer reviewed. So that's important to know too. But I see that the question about experience playing the game with kids, for example, middle school, which for those of you who aren't in the US is maybe ages 11, 12 up to about 14. And I think that's an interesting question. We get that a fair bit. It has been played less with that age group than, say, the university level, or we're getting a lot of high school interest lately. But it's been played, this is another element of the flexibility of the game. It's been played with CEOs of companies. It's been played with climate scientists. It can be played with government officials and government leaders. And we have had it played with middle school students. In fact, just this week I was in an email conversation with a teacher who did it with her middle school, and it was quite successful. And I asked her if she would like to be a resource for any of you out there who want to play it with middle school to see how it went with her. And she did say she would do that. So if I can connect you with that, we'll put our emails up at the end so you can get our emails, and I'll put it into the chat box as well. So yes, it has been done with middle school students.
Yeah, and I do want to just take note of the time. We're almost at the end of our time for the 1 hour webinar. So if we could just give you a little bit more information, and then we'll wrap up, and Jennifer and I are available to stay on for a few extra minutes. So as Jennifer said, if you could, we'd love to see you get out there and use this tool and really report back to us and tell us how it went. And enroll others in doing it as well. We also invite you to I'm sorry, here's some ways to learn. So as Jennifer mentioned, we've got the facilitator video and the guide. Go for it. We really would encourage you to just give it a try and host this event. And also invite somebody to apprentice with you to help you out and to learn from you. We've also supported events through webinars, and in fact, I've even run an event with Princeton University in collaboration with them on running the entire thing virtually, so we'll have a blog post about that. Or you could hire a facilitator from our community, and I think that you could become one of those facilitators that's hired. And we just encourage you to invite your friends and colleagues to join us. I would also, if you're interested in the research component, we are always looking for more people to join that effort. So I'd like to share with you, see if this works. If I type it in the chat box, people should be able to see it, right?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll type a URL in there, and if you could go to that page, you can find out how you can join our National Science Foundation funded work researching learning outcomes on world climate.
And I'd like to mention too that pretty much everything that we've been talking about today is on the website, including information about Juliet's research. There's links all over the website. But if you have a hard time navigating the website, or you just don't want to take the time to explore, you want to get to it quickly, please contact me. I'm happy to steer you in the right direction, or answer any of your questions, or point you to the right resource that can maybe help you. We're really looking forward to having many of you plan and host and facilitate, lead your own World Climate Exercise and bring more people to this community. I'd also like to remind people that if you're going to do it, or you have done it and you haven't registered on our website, so we can keep track of how many people are holding these events around the world and how many people we're reaching, that would be really helpful to us.
Yeah, that's critical. We need to know that, because otherwise, yeah. Do we already have, and Amanda's asking, do we have an Indonesian translation? And I think the answer to that is no, we don't yet have that. We would love to have that.
That would be great.
That would be fantastic.
If somebody wants to do it in Indonesia, that would be great. I'd actually have to go back to the map or the list and look to see if we have had one in Indonesia. I'm going to scroll right down on we have not had one in Indonesia yet, so that would be great.
Yeah, and Amanda, we would be very grateful for that translation. All right, so I think we want to thank you all for your time, and once again, if you'd like to stay on for a few minutes, we're here to answer additional questions. So thank you.
Yes, we're here. So those of you who need to run, fine. But if you have more questions, please put them in the question box. Let's see what else. I'm just looking at some of these.
Oh, great. Okay.
I put mine in. See, Rebecca, I put my email address into the chat box. Do you see it there? Let me know if you're not seeing that.
Yeah, and Becky asked, a lot of cities are doing sustainability commitments. Do you know of any cities using these models? That's a great question. I'm actually involved in an effort in my own home city of Somerville. We're engaged in a net zero planning effort, and we've used the model in order to convey the urgency and the scale of action needed, and how we can basically make sure that our local efforts are at an appropriate scale for the global challenge. And actually, I'd mention also, Becky, that I've used this model to share information with the Massachusetts State Legislature, as well as the 14 mayors of the Boston metropolitan area who are engaged in a climate action plan. So yes. And then in addition to that, we're using the model as an education tool in our efforts. So I'm not aware of, I don't know all of the similar actions that are going on out there with regards to city use of our tools. I would also mention that our colleague, director, yep.
I could speak to a little bit of that.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks, Travis.
Hi, I'm Travis Frank. I'm a program director at Climate Interactive. And one of the other projects that Juliet was just about to say is we do have a project in which we're using different models, not the model that Juliet and Jennifer presented, C-Roads, but we have another effort in which we're working on co-benefits and multiple benefits at the urban scale, such as green infrastructure in Milwaukee. So we have a green infrastructure tool, but these types of tools and these processes of engaging different civic groups, both municipal groups, citizens groups, businesses, etc., and getting them in the same room to talk about adaptation and mitigation efforts, we have been attempting to. And if you contact anyone in this webinar, or our colleague Beth Salwin, who's leading those efforts, so if you contact Jennifer, whose email is in the chat, we'll make sure to find the right person if you're interested in those types of efforts.
Thanks, Travis.
Let's see. Oh, here's a question about co-benefits from Becky. So we actually have a project on that too. It's called multi-solving, and our one of our co-directors, Beth Stalin, has a project where she's researching which pathways to climate change success, to address climate change in ways that will provide more benefits to health or job creation or water conservation or any of the other things that addressing climate change can actually also assist with. So we do have a project on that which you can look into on our website. It's called Multi-Solving.
Yeah, and Jeremy says suggestions for observers of a session anticipating taking the exercise elsewhere, maybe give them different roles like media reporters. And thank you so much for that, Jeremy. We actually have what we think of as sort of auxiliary or extra briefing statements. We have one for the press, for basically for media to do exactly that, to go around interviewing people, taking pictures, and I usually give them an opportunity to speak to kind of move the negotiations along. And we also have briefing statements for climate activists and for a fossil fuel lobby group. So those are all groups that don't actually input information directly into the simulation, but they can impact the negotiations and make them richer.
Any other questions out there? Just trying to go back and see if I missed any. I see we have volunteers to do Swedish and Indonesian, so that's great for translations. Do we know of any cities using these models?
Yeah, I think we just addressed that.
Oh, sorry, I must have been looking at something else at the time, answering a different question.
All right, so I think we're, maybe give people another minute and then. I do see one up near the top from Alejandra that I don't know if Alejandra is still on.
Adaptation.
Yeah, and I think that what could happen if vulnerable countries don't deliver adaptation commitments versus countries making adaptation commitments. I'm not, I guess here what I'm hearing there is partly at least if wealthy countries, vulnerable countries don't deliver adaptation commitments versus countries making adaptation commitments. I'm not sure if I'm understanding this correctly, but one piece is that as we see wealthy countries with the UN Green Climate Fund at least supposed to be helping and committing funds to the less developed countries to enable them to adapt and mitigate, that is something that we definitely see those dynamics playing out in the negotiation. And often one of the key take-homes that people gain from the exercise is the appreciation of social justice, really, as something that has an influence on the climate system as we make decisions that are connected to social justice. So if those wealthy, we do have the fund incorporated into the exercise, and often, just like in the real world, countries are not willing to make pledges unless they feel that they are being compensated adequately by that fund, by the wealthy countries.
Right, so we incorporated it into the simulation, but it's not part of the model. So it pretty much works through by, it becomes part of the negotiations, as you mentioned, but it's not actually incorporated into the model.
All right, and yeah, I think we're good then. Thank you all.
Thanks, bye everybody.